Chapter 27, Victory, May through June 1945. First, when our president died, I wondered if we was going to win this war without him. But I reckon he still let us through. Things ended quick, just like people were saying they would. The last day of April, Hitler killed himself, which was a sure sign the war wasn't going his way. Then about a week later, the Germans surrendered. Church bells rang all over town, and for a minute you didn't know whether to be sad because of Roosevelt not getting to hear them, or happy because it meant the war was over. But the happiness took over, and then you should have heard the noise in the polio ward. Such whooping and hollering. We started talking about how our daddies and brothers was coming home from war. Harvey stopped singing and humming and went into outright singing. I ain't gonna study no war no more, ain't gonna study no war no more, ain't gonna study war no more. I started thinking my daddy was coming home. But then people said our boys wasn't coming home right away. They still had work to do in Europe, cleaning up after the war and helping lost people find homes again. And some of them was going to be shipped to the islands in the Pacific to fight the Japanese, who was doing their best to take the part of the world Hitler hadn't got his hands on. The war wasn't really over yet, not until the Japanese surrendered too. I prayed my daddy wouldn't have to go to the Pacific. If he couldn't come home, I prayed he would get to help to rebuild Europe. As much as he hated killing, maybe now he could do something he felt good about. I give up on the idea of seeing him soon, and I tried hard not to be selfish about it. I put all my attention into seeing Mama and the girls. My physio said I could go home soon. My left leg was still weak, but I promised to do my exercises every day. And with a special brace and crutches, I was learning to walk. It wore me plumb out, but I practiced every day. I was determined to get out of that hospital. I decided that after I was home for a while, I'd probably still get to go to Warm Springs. Dr. Bennett come to Charlotte to check on us every so often, and he was still making plans for me to go. It wouldn't be the same as going while Roosevelt was alive, but I had a feeling that being in Warm Springs, breathing the air he breathed, just would give me the courage to face everything that come my way. Imogene went home before the war was even over. It seemed like just when we got Harvey to deliver our letters, she left me. I was so happy for her. Of course I was. But me, I was lonelier than ever. Well, at least I had her address, and I was going to write for sure. And she'd already sent me one letter. Dear Aunt Faye, see why I picked you out a blue color for your bottles? Because of you being true as the sky above. When that Harvey told me that yellow rose was the president's flower, I told him to take it right back to you. But he said that would be a slap in your face, and I knew he was right. Well, I tell you what, I cried when I heard our president died, and I cried even more when I got that rose. I reckons that brown and rainbow-colored bottle on God's windowsill is full and running over. I'm home now, and my mama is trying to fatten me up with biscuits and fried chicken and all kinds of home cooking. I put that rose in my mama's china cabinet with the glass door. Nobody can touch it, but everybody who sets foot in this house has to look at it if I have anything to say about it. I won't ever forget the one who gave it to me. Your friend, Imogene Wilfrong. When I read Imogene's letter, I decided that minute I got home I would put it in my little cedar box in the place of my president's yellow rose. Finally, right before the 4th of July, the hospital sent a letter to Mama telling her to pick me up on the weekend. I knew Junior would have to bring her. I was anxious to see him again, too, and his mother and Peggy Sue and the Hinkle sisters and Reverend Price and just everybody. That Saturday morning was sunny and hot. I was awake before daylight, and I couldn't get back to sleep. I thought I would jump plumb out of my skin waiting on Mama and Junior to get there. My bag of letters and personal items was packed and ready, but I was still wearing a hospital gown because I had to wait on Mama to bring me some clothes. It made me sad to think how they took my overalls off and probably burnt them when I got back to when I was at the Hickory Hospital. Them overalls was a sign of strength to me. They made me want to do all I could for this family so Daddy would be proud. I could hear his voice plain as yesterday saying, I expect you to be the man of the house while I'm gone. My daddy's voice never left me. It was one that got me through all the work in the garden, taking care of my sisters while Mama and Bobby was at the hospital and struggling to walk again. I stood at the window, straining to see my daddy's truck outside. I kept looking for Mama and Junior to come across the parking lot, but I didn't see them. Then I heard a voice behind me. Aunt Faye Honeycutt, are you coming home with me or not? And it was his voice. It was my daddy's voice. It scared me so bad to hear it like that, so unexpected. I was afraid to look because I knew I must have heard it in my head. But I turned, and there he stood. And not in his uniform neither. He was wearing black Sunday pants and his long-sleeved black shirt with sleeves half rolled up. His eyes was the color of overalls, in truth and faithfulness, and wisteria blossoms. I couldn't run to him, but I forgot that I couldn't, so I tried to, and I went crashing into the floor. Then my daddy run to me. He sunk to his knees and pulled me to him. "Daddy," I said, "why are you here? I didn't know. Oh, Daddy, I didn't expect to see you." We sat on the floor, and both of us cried till his shirt pocket was all wet. Mama was there, too. Daddy stood and helped me to my feet and pulled both of us into his big arms. I felt that broken-up feeling again because the girls and Bobby wasn't there. But I knew I would feel it for the rest of my life, so I just had to get used to it. Mama handed me a bag and told me to get dressed. When I reached inside, I found my blue overalls, the ones Daddy gave me when he went away. I just couldn't believe it. "But I thought you burned them," I said. "No," said Mama. "They boiled them along with the rest of the laundry at the hospital, and when I came to visit, they returned them to me." "But you never told me." Mama just smiled and gave me a quick kiss on the forehead. "I must have forgot," she said. Daddy's truck was parked at the entrance of the polio ward, and Ida and Ellie was hanging out the window when I got there. They would have knocked me over if Mama hadn't held them back. "Girls," she said, "your sister's on crutches. You're going to have to get into your head she just isn't as strong as she used to be." I didn't like Mama saying that, and Daddy knew I didn't. When we was all squeezed into that truck, he said, "Well, if you ask me, Aunt Faye is tougher than ever." He turned the key and pressed the starter button and said, "Who's going to help me shift this thing?" I knew he meant me because I was straddling a gear stick which come out from the floor. But after a minute, I noticed another reason he wanted me to shift. He wasn't using his right arm to drive, just his left one. "What happened to your arm, Daddy?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing much, honey, just a little war wound on the shoulder. It's the reason why they sent me home early. But it'll be all right. As long as I got your right arm, I can do without mine." We drove home like that, Daddy steering and pushing the pedals and me shifting the gears. I knew I was as put together as I could be. The best part of me was home again. He had a good left leg, and I had a good right arm, and that was enough for me. Daddy said he would take us to the diner to celebrate, but I said I was dying to get home. I said I'd help cook dinner if they'd just take me there. I'd started whining right off. "But Daddy, you promised," and Ellie said, "Yeah, Daddy." Daddy said, "Aunt Faye gets to decide. It's her big day." "Well, then," I said, "let's stop off for a root beer." So we did. But the whole time we was sitting on a bench outside the gas station, each of us drinking our very own dope. I just wanted to get back in that truck and drive out to the country. Just before I emptied my bottle, Daddy said, "Aunt Faye, I brought you something back from the war." He walked over to the pickup and reached under the seat for something he had put there. It was a brown paper sack. He brought it back and said, "Go ahead, look inside." All I wanted Daddy to bring me home from the war was himself. I couldn't imagine what else he had. I poked inside, and there was a bunch of papers all folded up together. I thought maybe they were wrapped up in something fragile, so I pulled them out real careful and unfolded them. I just couldn't believe what I seen. Them pages was covered with the pictures of tigers and lions and elephants, and on the bottom of every one it said, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bugs bite." Well, I reckon my daddy thought I wasn't happy to see them pictures on account of how I put my head between my knees and cried. But I just wasn't expecting them. All this time I'd grieved for not having any part of Bobby, not even Pete to remember him by. It never once crossed my mind that Daddy had a piece. I reckon I was so worried about him not coming back from the war that I never thought he might come and bring a little bit of Bobby with him. Daddy put his arms around me and rocked me and I hung on to him and sucked in the smell of his cigarettes and hair tonic, and I felt Mama and the girls hanging on to him and me both. It wasn't ever going to be like it was before, but at least Bobby had found a way to come back to us. "Let's go home," I said. All of a sudden I felt like I was going to split wide open if I didn't get there. When it was just about noon, we pulled into our dirt road. I was sucking it all in, the smell of the red dust we raised as we went down the road, the sight of honeysuckles in the side ditch, and the little colored church sitting off to the right. When we come around the last curve in the road, I seen our house sitting there the same as always. The sun was bouncing off the windows, Mama's roses were blooming out front, and the mimosa tree was covered over with pink fluffy blossoms again. The vegetable garden was growing up in weeds, and someone was out there hoeing. Junior Bloodsoe. He pulled off his straw hat and waved it like he was welcoming a soldier home from war. Then he come a-running. By the time we were out of the truck, his mama came out of the house and was hugging me like I was her lost puppy dog. Lord have mercy, I missed you, girl. She stepped back and looked me up and down. You need some meat on those bones. I fixed a big dinner. You better come and eat. Junior was waiting behind his mama then, swatting the straw hat against his thigh and studying me like maybe he thought I was different now. But I reckon he decided I wasn't, because he put his straw hat on my head and said, "Hey, Aunt Faye, you better hurry up and eat some taters and fried chicken. That garden needs to be weeded real bad." "Well then, Junior Bledsoe," I said, "you and me better crank up that tiller." Epilogue. If you ask folks about what they remember about 1945, a child might say, "That was the year my daddy come back home from war." A mother is likely to look in your eye and declare that polio could never keep us down. And the Hickory Daily Record will say it was the year the Miracle of Hickory closed its doors. If anything knows about them things, it's me, Aunt Faye Honeycutt for sure. But if you ask me what I remember, I will say it was the year Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and I got one of his flowers. I will tell you that the yellow rose gave me the courage to do the right thing, even when it was hard. I will say it was a time in my life when I learned all of us are as fragile as a mimosa blossom. But the miracle of it all is, when push comes to shove, we can be just as tough as hickory. It mostly hurts at first, but after a while, it starts to feel better. What's real and what's not? Polio epidemics were very real and very scary. The first major epidemic in America, affecting tens of thousands of people, came in 1916, and polio returned every summer after that. No one could predict where or when it would strike. In 1944, Western North Carolina was hit by polio. Health officials chose Hickory as a place to treat patients because it had a camp that could become a hospital. The emergency hospital expanded from one building to 14 wards. Sometimes men worked overnight in the rain to get the next ward built. Some wards had canvas tin roofs, wooden floors, half walls, screens up the other half of the walls, and flaps to keep out the rain. As cooler weathers came, builders turned the tent wards into permanent buildings. North Carolina's governor sent prisoners to do the laundry and kitchen work. The Red Cross and the March of Dimes recruited doctors and nurses from across the country. Hickory residents donated lumber, food, blankets, electric fans, and toys. Many volunteered their time and hard work. Reporters from national magazines wrote about the miracle of Hickory. The March of Dimes had a movie about the hospital, which showed in theaters across America to raise money to fight polio. Although most public buildings were racially segregated at the time, former patients remember whites and blacks sharing wards. However, the Hickory Daily Record referred to a colored convalescent ward. Apparently, the races were separated when they left the contagious ward. Who was real and who was not? Aunt Faye Honeycutt and Imogene Wilfrong, and their family and friends, are fictitious characters. Most of the hospital staff is fictitious as well. However, some of the characters were real people who made Hickory's emergency hospital a true miracle. Dr. H.C. Wims was the county health officer, and Dr. Gather Hahn was the local physicians. Both worked selfishly to establish the hospital and care for polio patients. Mrs. Earl Townsend was making blackberry cobbler for campers when Dr. Wims told her to send the children home, and she stayed to cook for the patients and hospital staff. Dr. Dorothy Horstman was one of the 3 Yale researchers who came to Hickory to study the spread of polio. Frances Allen was the public health nurse who visited homes and collected specimens for Yale researchers. The hot packs that Aunt Faye and Imogene endured were the treatment methods of a woman named Sister Elizabeth Kinney. Miss Kinney was an Australian Army nurse who pioneered a treatment for polio patients, replacing body casts and splints with moist heat massage. Australian doctors shunned her methods, so she brought them to the United States. At first, the United States doctors were skeptical, but within a few years, many recommended the Kinney methods for restoring mobility to affected muscles. A little girl named Shelby was a patient at the Hickory Hospital, as was Danny Morey, whose father made a home movie of the hospital. I saw the movie and interviewed Danny and Shelby as well as other patients who shared their memories of the hospital and how it felt to have polio. Miss Ruth, Aunt Faye's physiotherapist, is fictitious, but I named her after a wonderful physical therapist named Ruth, who worked there during 3 other polio epidemics and helped me with my research. Her compassion and twinkle in her eye were very real. Dr. Robert Bennett was the director of physical medicine at the Polio Rehabilitation Center in Warm Springs, Georgia during this time. He made numerous visits to Hickory Charlotte hospitals to assess the progress of patients. Franklin D. Roosevelt was an active 39-year-old politician when polio struck him in 1921. He dropped out of politics and focused on trying to walk again. Then, in 1924, he visited a resort in Georgia with Warm Springs. He loved the place so much he bought it and turned it into a rehabilitation center for people with polio. The next thing Dr. Roosevelt knew, he was in the warm pools leading other polios to his favorite water exercises. But his friends wanted him back in politics, so he interrupted his plan to learn to walk again. He ran for governor of New York and then for president of the United States. As president, he had a little less time to spend at Warm Springs, but it's still one of his favorite places to relax. He died there on April 12, 1945. Not everyone agreed with Roosevelt's politics, but he was loved by millions because he cared about the average American and proved that people with disabilities can do great things. Because of his example, America began to see that people with disabilities should have access to the same activities that able-bodied people enjoy. Even poor Americans like Ann Fay were welcome at Warm Springs. It still operates as a leading rehabilitation center. A visit to Quiet Warm Springs offers a look at the Roosevelt Institution for Rehabilitation, the historic warm water pools, Roosevelt's Little White House, and the FDR State Park. Polio today. During the epidemics, Americans were eager to help the March of Dimes, which was began by Roosevelt and his friends during 1938. Though the president's birthday balls and other fundraising events, the organization raised millions of dollars for polio care and increased research. Since 1908, scientists have known that polio was caused by a virus. In 1952, two scientists, one of them was Dorothy Hortsman, proved that the polio virus travels into the bloodstream before it attacks the nervous system and causes paralysis. This meant that the vaccine could prevent the paralyzing cases of polio. But which scientists would create a vaccine and how would it work? Two scientists, Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk, wanted to put a bit of the polio virus into healthy people. They hoped the body would then produce antibodies to fight the disease. In 1954, when Salk successfully vaccinated children against polio, Americans idolized him. But eventually, Sabin's vaccine proved more effective and easier to give, and for decades it replaced Salk's vaccine. Now both are used in different places of the world depending upon the need. The Western Hemisphere has declared free of polio in 1994, and the World Health Organization is close to ridding the entire world of polio. Unsolved mysteries. With the arrival of the vaccine, polio research declined. Polio faded from our memories, and many questions went unanswered. We never learned for sure why polio flared up that summer. We don't know why polio affected a particular area one summer and moved to another the next. We do know that the polio virus is passed through the contact with human feces. The germs enter the mouth, multiply in the intestines, and then move to the spinal cord, where they cripple parts of the nervous system. We know that a boy like Bobby might have contracted the virus from a latch on the outhouse door, from a doorknob, or from any person who had the germs on his hands. Since Bobby's twin sisters complained of tummy aches, they could have had a mild case of polio that they got from Bobby and passed to Aunt Fay. Oh, and what about the dog? Polio Pete showed up at the emergency hospital during the early part of the epidemic and was adopted by the hospital staff. By mid-August, the Hickory Daily Record reported that Pete had gone missing. Later, his body was found under the hospital buildings. Newspaper reporters speculated that Pete's master was a patient at the hospital, and no one ever knew who his dog was. I thought an old faithful dog like Pete deserved an adoring owner like Bobby Honeycutt. Finding this story. A few years ago, I called the director of my local historian association. I told him I'd be attending a history writing workshop and had an assignment to find an interesting local story. The director suggested the miracle of Hickory and the 1944 polio epidemic. I hurried to our city library for more information and spent the afternoon reading stories out of my townspeople pulling together in a crisis. Right away, I wanted to write about this event. I didn't know who my characters would be, but I was excited by the library book I'd found. Alice E. Sink's The Grit Behind the Miracle, a nonfiction account of the Hickory's polio epidemic and emergency hospital. Sink's book is filled with events, dates, and important figures. It contains personal stories of the patients and staff at the hospital. I quickly learned all of the details of my story were hidden in history itself. I simply had to dig for details. Much of my research involved reading old copies of the Hickory Daily Record. Like Anne Faye Honeycutt, I found advertisements, war news, and stories of the polio hospital. I traveled to nearby towns to read old issues of the Charlotte Observer, the Charlotte News, and the Greensboro Daily News. I read books about polio, President Roosevelt, World War II, and racial segregation. I visited historical sites as far apart as Warm Springs, Georgia, and Auschwitz, Poland. I interviewed museum directors, physical therapists, and patients who had had polio. To learn about life in the 1940s, I scanned books about antiques. I listened to old radio shows and 40s music. I interviewed senior citizens and World War II vets. The problem was research is that once I had to start, I couldn't seem to stop. I filled my shelves with great books on my subject. I'll mention a few resources that were especially helpful. The end.